focusing on tracking speech production changes and underlying brain atrophy over time in non-semantic variants of primary progressive aphasia.
Thank you. I'd just like to acknowledge the team that I work with at the Frontotemporal Dementia Research Group at the University of Sydney, who are a wonderful group to work with, and Christian Layton, who is one of the authors of this paper, is here today as well. So this is about primary progressive aphasia. Obviously we had another talk today about that. We know it's a difficulty with language, and the most prominent deficit at symptom onset is the language difficulties, and for at least 2 years. And we know that no other conditions better account for the language deficit, so it's initially an isolated language deficit. We know there are 3 types: the semantic, which is dissolution of semantic knowledge; a non-fluent version, which is a bit like Broca's aphasia, and highly frequently, about 80% of these cases also have an apraxia of speech, which is higher than in stroke. And also the logopenic group, which have word finding and impaired sentence repetition. And Christian Layton developed a flowchart to help with clinical diagnosis of these conditions. And the key thing here is that whilst the first step is deciding if they have single word comprehension deficits, the second step is deciding if they have a motor speech disorder, so that you can then put them into different categories. So of course the problem with the typical motor speech disorder is apraxia of speech. There is also some cases with dysarthria, but we come back to the old problem. Does this person have apraxia of speech as well as aphasia? So a lot of the work that I've been doing over the last many years is trying to work out more objective ways to come up with that decision, to make that decision. So detecting apraxia of speech, and we did that in stroke a couple of years ago now, 2016. We published a paper that was looking at a large group of 72 stroke patients and trying to identify behaviours that predicted whether or not this person had apraxia of speech, using Joe Duffy and Mick McNeil, who are world experts in magically figuring out if someone has apraxia of speech, were our gold standards, and essentially came up with 2 measures that really highly correlated with their decision of apraxia or not. One was performance in our task, words of increasing length, thick and thickening, and the other was a measure of lexical stress production. The relative vowel durations in 3-syllable words, and we developed, we pinched this measurement from linguistics called pairwise variability index. And we actually then went on to do a similar study, actually at the same time, in progressive aphasia, looking at the logopenic and the non-fluent variants, and came up with a very similar answer. We didn't do that thick and thickening task in this group, but we did do the polysyllabic word productions and came up with the same answer, but that PVI measure was really quite sensitive to detecting the apraxia of speech. But the problem is those were cross-sectional studies. We know that overlapping features with disease progression and heterogeneous disease cause challenge diagnosis and prognosis. It's often hard to tell early on, but it becomes more prominent later, and then as they get much further along in the disease, they start to blend again. So we wanted to know if the difference is present at onset and maintained over time, and which neural mechanisms are involved. And so we had a pretty good sample of patients, 40 logopenic patients, 39 non-fluents and 40 controls, and who looked pretty similar at baseline. And they'd been tested for between 1 and 5 years, multiple times. And we did our repetition of 3-syllable word tasks, so they said things like dinosaur and banana. And what we do is, this is a super simple measure to make, as long as you're not frightened of looking at a spectrogram. And so at the top we've got a healthy adult saying banana. I know that's a big barrier, but we have a healthy adult saying banana, so it's really these weak, strong words are critical. And down the bottom, someone with apraxia of speech, and we get this pairwise variability index, which is we look at those 2 vowels, which are the blue bits, and we get the difference between them, and then we divide them by the average, and then multiply by 100. That's what we do. So for example, if that was 20 milliseconds and that was 100, the difference divided by the average times 100 would be 133. And down here, our apraxic patient would end up with a score more like 40 because the difference is much smaller. And we know that as they approach 0, it's like having equal stress. And there's a threshold around 100 and 112, which below that is where almost all apraxic patients fall when they say these words. So we looked at them at baseline, and what we found was at presentation, they obviously already had cortical atrophy, but the data down the bottom, that non-fluent patients showed lower PVIs than controls in weak, strong words at presentation, which is what you expect, but the logopenic patients didn't, but that measurement didn't distinguish the two. And then we get these beautiful trajectories over time, where you see the blue are the non-fluents and the red are the logopenics, and you can see that lovely decline. Well, it's not lovely. Very clear differentiation of these two groups over time, and very quickly it was correlated nicely with atrophy in the left motor cortex in the non-fluent patients and bilateral frontal regions, but no associations in the logopenic patients, which is exactly what you'd expect. So again, support for this measure as a diagnostic marker for breakthrough speech. Sorry.